So why don't you grab Devotional Classics and turn over to John Bailey. Now if you take a look here, take a look at page 108. These are excerpts from a diary of private prayer. Now what we learn in a reading like this, catch this now, because evangelicals are not great at this. You can pray somebody else's prayer. It's all right. Prayer does not always need to be spontaneous for it to be from the Spirit of God. Because these are really wonderful prayers. Who would not want to pray some of these prayers? How about this kind of prayer? And you're praying it. You're really praying it. This day, O Lord, give me courtesy. Give me meekness of bearing, decision of character. Give me long-suffering. Give me chastity. Give me sincerity of speech. Give me diligence in my allotted task. And so on. So, be free. Be free from the burden of always having to pray spontaneously. Sometimes it's just too much. And other times, God calls us to pray spontaneously. God touches us with the Spirit, and we just got to let out a hoot. Or we're moved to pray very specifically and fervently for someone. At other times, we use somebody else's prayers. Turn back to page 350. Søren Kierkegaard, this Dane living in the 19th century. Look at section 1 here. I want you to remember this phrase, if you can. Moved in infinite love. Moved in infinite love. In this section, he begins by saying, God is unchangeable. God is unchangeable. And then he says, yet God is moved in infinite love. He says, you are not like us. If we are to preserve only some degree of constancy, we must not permit ourselves too much to be moved, nor by too many things. You, on the contrary, are moved, and moved in infinite love by all things. Even that which we human beings call an insignificant trifle, and pass by unmoved, the need of a sparrow, even this moves you. And what we so often scarcely notice, a human sigh, this moves you, you who are unchangeable. So, if you remember from last class, why should I bother God with the petty details of my life? Well, there's Kierkegaard's response. There's nothing that God is not interested in or moved by. God is moved in infinite love by the smallest, seemingly most insignificant things. There's nothing in your life that God is not interested in or moved by. So this one who is unchangeable, Kierkegaard says, at the same time, is made himself very vulnerable to us. All right, let's move on here in terms of petitionary prayer. What's the difference between petitionary prayer and intercessory prayer? Do you remember? I might ask you, petitions, we're praying largely for ourselves. Intercessory prayer, we're praying for other people. Praying for other people. So we're focusing on petitionary prayer here, and we've talked about the intensely personal nature of God, and then we began to work through the answers, or at least a framework of answering some of these questions. Let's go to the next question. So all of the points that I want to make for the rest of this morning have to do with this perplexity that all of us will feel at one time or another when God, it seems, does not answer our prayer. And the first principle would be this. Someone comes up to you and they're in distress. And they're in distress spiritually. And they're in distress because they have been praying about something that was of great meaning to them, great import to them. And the answer did not come as they had hoped. And they're on the edge of tears, and they're wondering why. Why? Why didn't God hear? Why did my mother die? I had a student come up when we talked about prayer one time about 10 years ago, and she said, Dr. Hall, I prayed for year after year after year that my father would stop coming into my room at night. And God never heard those prayers. That's serious stuff, isn't it? Serious stuff. So we're in deep water here. So the first principle in trying to help somebody else, or perhaps even help yourself, would be this. Never be glib or flippant in your response. Now here's a glib or flippant response to this question of, does God always answer prayer? And I've heard some people say, sure, God always answers prayer. God says yes or God says no. Well, that's true. But it's not all that helpful. And particularly, that's not helpful if somebody's wondering about the kinds of situations I just mentioned, is it? What we want to know is, if God said no, or God didn't respond to that particular prayer, why? Because oftentimes we hurt so deeply from what seems to be this lack of response in God, and we can become deeply disappointed with God. Like I've shared in here, there was one time in my life where I hated God. I hated God. And I hated God because God seemed to have said no to the most important prayer I ever prayed. A prayer that seemed so in line with what the Scripture invited me to pray. It had to do with God hating divorce. I prayed and prayed my family would stay together, and just like someone threw a hand grenade in the family circle. So never be glib or flippant. Lewis writes this: every war, every famine or plague, almost every deathbed is the monument to a petition that was not granted. Don't be flippant. Yes, God will say no sometimes, but when he does so, it's serious business, and we need to think it through, why this might be. This is an interesting one. Forsyth writes this, quote, "We shall come one day to a heaven where we shall gratefully know that God's great refusals were sometimes, that's important, were sometimes the answers to our truest prayer." And I've shared with you, I want to do it again, I've shared with you the story of Reba Yoder. Did I talk to you about Reba? I can't remember. Reba was a woman in foundations. And we were talking about prayer like this. And she stood out from the other students in the class because she was about 25 years older than all of the other students. She was in her mid-40s, I would say. And she came up to me after class and said, she was very direct. She said, "I liked what you had to say about prayer." I smiled, and she said, "I liked it. My name's Reba Yoder. I've got cancer." And I said, "Oh, Reba, I'm sorry." And we became friends. And started to pray together about her cancer. And it went into remission. It was a wondrous thing. It seemed like God was hearing our prayers very clearly and directly, and we were as pleased as anything. She had children and grandchildren and a wonderful husband. Oh, how we wanted her life to continue. And I remember she was in Oregon on a trip. And she was not feeling all that well before she went to Oregon. She flew out to Oregon to see some relatives. And I got a phone call from Reba in Oregon. And she said, "Chris, the cancer's come back." And I said, "Oh, no." And then I said, "We really need to pray." And she said, "You're right. We really need to pray." And I said, "All right, let's pray." And I started to pray for healing again. And she says, "Hold on. Hold on. We need to pray that I die like a Christian." And I said, "No. No, I'm not going to do that. I don't want you to die. I want you to be around." And she said, "Stop it." I'll never forget that. "Stop it." And I fought her on that. I'm telling you, I fought her on that because I wanted her around. And she just would chew me out. Finally, Joe Modica and I said, Reba will come out and visit you every Friday. And remember that big snowstorm back in, I guess it was 94, 95, that huge, huge snowstorm? The Friday before that snowstorm hit, she was in a gurney, lying on a gurney in the kitchen, because she loved the kitchen. And she's on this gurney and she's semi-comatose. The music is about sung to its conclusion, is how I would put it. And her bed the gurney was up on its edge like this, so she was sitting up. And she was not with us the whole time we were there. And so I could see, Lord, this is hard. I want her back. Are you hearing our prayers? Take care of her. Be with her. And I was talking like that, and Joe was there. And I said to her, I didn't think she was listening. I said, "Reba, we'll be back next Friday, but we got to go." And I started to walk away, and suddenly she reached out and grabbed my hand. And she opened her eyes. And she didn't say anything because she couldn't speak any longer. So I spoke to her, and I said, "Reba, you want me to stay longer?" And she nodded her head yes. And I said, "That's fine." And so I held her hand, and we prayed. We're still praying, but I know what she wants me to pray. See, God heard the deeper intent of her prayer. It wasn't as though God was not answering. It was almost like in the history of Christian spirituality, the healthiest Christians have spoken as the death of a Christian as deep healing. Isn't that interesting? Deep healing. She's holding my hand. I'm whispering in her ear different things because I realized something's going on here. And finally I said, "Reba, it's time to go." And she opened her eyes, and I walked down to the foot of her gurney, and Joe's next to me, and she looked straight at me, and she waved goodbye. Straight at me. And she died the next day. God heard the deeper intent of her prayer. I was praying, maybe, "Lord, heal Reba." I really do believe in healing. Heal Reba. And the Lord was saying, "Son, I'm going to heal Reba, but it's going to be a very deep healing, and one that will be painful for you and for her." And yet in that entire experience, I'm telling you, it was like Christ was waltzing with her day in and day out, singing to her music that on most days only she was hearing. So you want to think that one through when you're praying, and actually be encouraged by that. God knows what you're praying when you're praying it. Sometimes it's like I'm just fumbling in prayer, mumbling. And yet he knows exactly what I'm saying. I might be asking for A, but he knows that below the petition A is a much deeper need being expressed. And that's what he's going to respond to at that point in time. The danger of short-sightedness in our prayer. The danger of short-sightedness. So for instance, romantic relationships. We really pray when it comes to romantic relationships, do we not? I was convinced probably at least 4 or 5 times that I'd met a wondrous woman, and oh Lord, she is the one, I know it. My heart sings when I see her, Lord. I just never seen anything like that in my whole life. Oh, God, please, please, please answer my prayer. Oh, I couldn't bear the pain. And now I look back, 30 years later, and I think, oh my goodness, if I had married her and she me, there would have been dual murders or something worse. And you can chuckle at that point. You can chuckle. But it's really hard when we're so directly involved in something to see clearly. To see clearly. So God, thank goodness, is very gentle with us at those points and sometimes protects us from our own short-sightedness. So you might journal about that. Have there been instances where you can look back and see, I was short-sighted, and God protected me from my short-sightedness?